Hi, welcome to this second podcast. My name's Anurag Jain. This is for my fellow teachers at the Langdon Park School, mostly, but for anyone who's interested in formative assessment, and specifically the work of Shirley Clarke. And what I'm going to be doing in these series of podcasts is walking you through the majority of her work. The book that I really recommend that you look at is Outstanding Formative Assessment, but if you're looking for another great one, this earlier book, Active Learning Through Formative Assessment. I have some copies of this. If anybody wants, you can email me and get in touch. What we are talking about is how to understand what's going on in formative assessment and to really see how Shirley Clarke takes us from the theory to the practice. And what we did in the first session was we talked about the learning culture, because all the techniques and all the pedagogy that we have doesn't really mean a lot if students aren't actually engaged in a culture of learning within the school, within the classroom, within your classroom, within the school as a whole, within your department. There has to be a sense of a learning culture. And we talked about the growth mindset, we talked about metacognition, and we talked about the need for mixed ability teaching, all things that she talks about. And obviously, this text of Shirley Clarke's and her works has been hugely influential on me. It helped me understand so much of what Dylan Wiliam was getting on about, and of course what we're going to do is work through a lot of our ideas, but actually now that I put this together, I'm going to branch out in different directions too. So I'm going to try to bridge between, a good starter bridges between the last learning and the new learning. So I want you to think about these two questions. You can pause and think or take notes, or just think to yourself or write down. But I want you to think about how many interactions do you have with students where they reveal their mindset, their attitudes, and their anxieties. And within the context of the classroom, how much space do we give for students to articulate their emotions, ideas, and thoughts? So to get you thinking about that, I'm going to start with a passage from an article from Diane Ray and Dylan Wiliam from 1999, titled "I'll Be a Nothing," and it's about the way students identify with themselves through assessment. I'm really scared about the SATs. Mrs. O'Brien came and talked to us about our spelling, and I'm no good at spelling, and David is giving us times tables tests every morning, and I'm hopeless at times tables, so I'm frightened I'll do the SATs, and I'll be a nothing. I don't understand, Hannah. You can't be a nothing. Yes, you can, because you have to get a level like a level 4 or a level 5, and if you're no good at spellings and timetable, you didn't get those levels, and so you're a nothing. I'm sure that's not right. Yes, it is, because that's what Mrs. O'Brien was saying. What you can hear in the students' language here is not only a miscomprehension, but perhaps it is quite accurately a comprehension based on what she perceives the teachers to be saying. The high-pressure nature of the assessment, we can sense the anxiety, articulated in the notion of a complete loss of identity. Because for Hannah, what constitutes academic success is correct spelling and times tables. She's an accomplished writer, gifted dancer, an artist, Ray and William write, and good at problem solving, yet none of those skills make her somebody in her own eyes. Instead, she constructs herself as a failure, an academic non-person, by a language shift in which she comes to see herself entirely in terms of the level to which her performance in the SATs is ascribed. So this is an interesting passage for me. It's really stimulating because it really makes me reflect on the anxieties that this system puts on students, but the anxiety that we teachers put on the students themselves. I'm just gonna make a little adjustment there. Put on the students themselves, and how their language can reveal deep-seated sense of worry and miscomprehension here, but maybe not miscomprehension, maybe an actual articulation of something worrisome. Well, what I'm going to argue today is that we need to talk about talk. Talk is the number one way where we find out what's actually going on in students' heads. Okay, before we move on, let's have a little quiz, and you can pause. I'd like you to evaluate these statements in terms of growth mindset theory, the stuff we talked about in the last video. So what's wrong with the statement, you're an HPA, you should be making more progress? HPA is short for high prior attainer. You should be making more progress. Okay, of course you can pause to write down your answers to get the quiz, but since this is a video, I'm just going to move on. Okay, so being an HPA versus having higher prior attainment should be carefully articulated. Where you put identity it leads to a kind of fear in a student, whereas and a fixed mindset. Whereas growth would focus on action or effort, not an identity that is fixed. Why are you finding this so hard? You did this so easily last time. The problem there is effort is degraded. You should never look towards effort. Ricky Gervais says, when he was in school, the best way to be would be to have done well and put in no effort. That's like the goal. That's the golden fleece, and we just have to break that notion completely. Some students will put in less effort than others and attain higher, but effort is what should never be degraded. It should always be celebrated. I noticed how hard you're trying and how you didn't give up. Attainment is not as important as effort and resilience. And note, those words don't have to be used. How hard you're trying and how you didn't give up are both completely meaningful phrases that do refer to effort and resilience, but just a different way of articulating. Before getting frustrated with yourself, why don't you stop and reflect about what you might be finding hard here? So what's good about that? That is metacognition, encouraging the student to think about what's going on within themselves and to reflect. All of this is the stuff we talked about last time with growth mindset theory, and is going to walk us into what we're going to talk about today, which is talk. So what we're going to talk about already, we've started to think about how do we elicit evidence and how do we listen and interpret. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. The obvious advantages of a rich talk classroom. I'm going to talk about some theorists. Some Shirley Clarke discusses, some she doesn't. I'm going to look at a dissenting opinion in Daisy Christodoulou. I'm going to take you back to the Dialogic classroom and Robin Alexander and go to scaffolding, ZPD, and speech to thought, Vygotsky, and then we'll go moving from the theory into the practice. Again, I think the theory is really important to think about, not only to find the underlying attitudes and opinions, but to animate what it is that the actual practical techniques are supposed to be doing. So I want to thank my friend Kim Van Duzer for recommending this book years ago. I was having a lot of trouble with students' behavior, and this book she recommended, and I loved it, and I'm sharing it with you. And also I really loved it because of these cartoons. So here I want to think about talk from the teacher standpoint. Isn't just about right now. This is monologic. This is me delivering a lecture based on my thoughts and my ideas. It isn't dialogic insofar as we can't converse and discuss what's going on. But when you're with a child, it's really important that you show that you're actively listening. So this book's really good because it shows how it shouldn't be done and then how it should be done. I can hear you. Go on. Eric punched me, Daddy. Do you hear me? So I hit him back. Then he hit me again. Are you listening? I'm listening to every word. No, you're not. I can listen and watch the game at the same time. Go on. Oh, forget it. Well, this is the way it should be done. Eric punched me. So, Daddy, do you hear me? So I hit him back. And he hit me again, even harder. He's mean. The adult has turned and given their full attention to the child and listens. And the boy comes to his own idea. Know what? I'm going to play with Danny from now on. He doesn't go around punching people. Sometimes listening, and particularly active listening, is something that isn't really thought about from the standpoint of adults. And it is something that if you learn to do, we can't just lament that kids don't talk. we should lament that we don't listen. And this book is quite powerful on this topic. My turtle's dead. He was alive this morning. Now, don't get so upset, honey. Don't cry. It's only a turtle. Stop that. I'll buy you another turtle. I don't want another one. Now you're being unreasonable. Instead of denying emotions and forcing, giving names to feelings can be quite powerful. My turtle is dead. He was alive this morning. Oh, what a shock. He was my friend. To lose a friend can hurt. I taught him to do tricks. You two had fun together. I fed him every day. You really cared about that turtle. These neutral, reflective comments permit the student to have feelings, to have thoughts. And it's a form of active listening that I think we've got to think about before we simply run into the idea of how are we going to get students to talk better. I think we need to think about how are we going to actively listen to the evidence that we're getting from students when they speak. So this is from Pauline Gibbons, just to get you to think before I give you an idea, and again, you could pause. When is correction essential, in your opinion? When is correcting a student's speech essential? When does correction, or how can correction sometimes inhibit expression? And what is more important, communication or correct communication? Okay, you can pause and discuss or write your own idea down. This is from Pauline Gibbons. This is from this book, English Learners, Academic Literacy and Thinking. Excellent book. I highly recommend it. All the books I hope I'm bringing to your attention are worth looking at. I've tried to zoom in on the parts that are the most worth looking at. Children who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, or children who come to school speaking another language or a non-standard dialect of English, are less likely to be familiar with the language and literacy of school. What I thought was very interesting about this passage was the way that Pauline Gibbons looks at students who have English isn't their first language in English-speaking schools, but also how socioeconomic background can also be an inhibiting factor towards understanding the way language works in school. Now, again, here's another cartoon from the book about language. Here's a good cartoon for feedback gone wrong. Yesterday, I goed at the zoo. You went to the zoo. It was gooder than anything. It was better than anything. Yeah, I goed to the zoo. You went to the zoo. Yeah, I goed. You went. Yeah, not yeah. Yes. This comic kind of exemplifies one concept of Pauline Gibbons, and I'm already declaring my hand here in saying that sometimes when we correct communication, we can stifle it. That sometimes speech is a means for students to get their ideas out. And this is particularly important for students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and also who are not native speakers, that the idea of communication itself and not correct communication is something that we need to think about and explore. Again, it's an aspect of learning to listen on the teacher's standpoint that will allow the student to speak more, to express themselves more. Again, to provoke you, when is the point where the correction needs to come in place? What is the purpose of talk? What is the purpose of the learning in the classroom? If the purpose is correct grammatical articulation, fine, perhaps. If it's to recount the events of what happened on the trip yesterday, it might be worth thinking about how this approach might have stifled or failed the student in achieving the intention for the day. These are some obvious, this is from straight out of Shirley Clarke, the benefits of a talk-rich classroom, which we're all familiar with. Better behavior, focus, listening to each other. Higher quality written work's really interesting, and she's done some work with Pi Corbett, whose work is here. You should, if you're not familiar with his Talk for Writing series, I think you should take a look at it. Increase confidence, relief at being able to articulate ideas, learning from each other, mutual respect, making new friends, inclusion, particularly when hands up is eliminated. And we're going to talk about that in the practical standpoint. But the idea of a talk-rich classroom is one of mutual collaboration and inclusion. That's the idea of talk. So we've talked about some of the advantages, and we've talked about this idea of listening. Let's move into some of the theory. Why is talk? What's the theory behind some of this idea of talk? Well, some of the theorists that have been really important, philosophers rather, who've been really important to education, didn't just look at education as something like, if I were to do a parody of how education is sometimes talked about right now in the fashionable currents, is the science of knowledge retention. Well, no, education was, for many philosophers, was part of a much larger political project. It was about freedom, equality, and liberation. So, for example, for Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a philosopher who was influential in the thinking behind the French Revolution, here's just a very famous quote from his Social Contract: "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." It is society that binds our freedom. It is society that leads men to be controlled. You can think of Blake's mind-forged manacles, perhaps. And education has that potential, or education acts as a chain, perhaps, whereas it has the potential of being a means towards freedom and liberation. This is certainly something that one of the 20th century's greatest philosophers, social philosophers, John Dewey, would have recognized. Education is not preparation for life, he argued, but education is life itself. Education isn't a kind of holding house for Dewey. Education, his great work, Democracy and Education, is that education itself should be democratic to reflect the society that we want to live in. Another absolutely excellent book I highly recommend is John Dewey's very modestly hilarious title, How We Think. Again, he thought very deeply, not just about the way the mind works and not just how the classroom should work, but that how the classroom and what goes on in schools actually can become an emanation for what should happen in society. So, look, we have to learn things. We have to learn facts. To say no is just ridiculous. But how and why we learn are really important too. Why we're learning brings us back to these ideas in that learning culture. Why we're learning is for a project towards greater equality and freedom. To these philosophers, education had the responsibility to pursue that. How we're going to do that often is through students speaking and giving their own ideas. This is Paulo Friere from his classic book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's one of my favorite quotes from that book. Why don't you? He quotes some. He worked with peasants, rural societies. In education, the work of Auguste Boal was influenced by Friere. He did it in drama. Friere worked on literacy. Why don't you, said a peasant participating in a cultural circle, explain the pictures first? That way it'll take less time and won't give us a headache. I love this quotation because it really captures what it is that Friere is going for, that it's not enough to tell people what to think. And sometimes it might even be easier to do that. But actually the responsibility, the pedagogy of the oppressed, means to actually facilitate disenfranchised people from believing that education itself is vital and important. And this quotation kind of exemplifies how disoriented and how out of place so many people feel by education. Rural peasants, but maybe our students as well. The critical pedagogy that comes from him, it comes from a place of, there was gross injustice, of political oppression and poverty. Education wasn't for Friere just about learning things. It's about changing the way things work. And part of our responsibility is to teach students to be critical consumers of information, to develop a voice, to assert, argue, and participate in the political and cultural world that surrounds them. So the dissenting view comes from the recently christened with her member of the British Empire, Daisy Christodoulou. She wrote this book a while ago to much fanfare, and it got her a lot of attention. And it's a quite polemical book. It's looking for a fight. Anyone looking for a fight should pick it up. It's an easy, quick read, bestseller. It's quite, what it's doing is it's recovering the notion of knowledge, direct instruction, and it's fighting against kind of hippie ideas about discovery, inquiry, and other pedagogies that are, just defend in name really bad practice under the name of progressive. Okay, but what this book also takes real, amazing cavalier shots at these major philosophers, particularly Rousseau, Dewey, and Friere, because she kind of doesn't believe that they pay enough attention or care enough about knowledge itself, facts. And in addition to these readings perhaps being quite limited, let me just again think about the question I'd provoke to readers of this book is, well, okay, what is the actual purpose of education? I've tried to give the idea of what Rousseau, Dewey, and Friere would say. For Daisy Christodoulou, it's worth thinking about as well. This was her second book, a much better book. Again, a very provocative book, but maybe a great deal less polemical. And it's really interesting because it's about the future of assessment for learning, formative assessment, something very dear to my heart. So I've read this book a number of times because it's very provocative and really challenges your thinking and thinking about assessment, the way assessment works, its purposes within lesson assessment, but also long-term assessment. And it really is a very interesting work to think about how assessment works, what its purposes are, and it's a work worth thinking about if you want to understand what Ofsted's thinking as well. The thing, I'm not a writer of her prominence, but I can offer my own ideas and some of the problems with this work. Seven Myths was written when she was the head of research for the ARCS, and I think the way academies and free schools have marketized and changed the nature of how and similarly charter schools in America change the nature of what's going on in education is worth noting and situating within her work. Her work also speaks to and is concurrent with an aggressive turn towards traditional methods and curriculum. I'm thinking simultaneously of the austerity of the coalition government, and afterwards, and of course the changes that were initiated by Gove. Also, the surge of research ed and the notion of what works, and an increased sense of certainty with teaching, an absolute confidence, an absolute prescriptive sense of what is right and how it should be done. Whereas a lot of the philosophers I was talking about were a little bit more tentative and while sure about the goals, the means were not overly determined, where this sense of what works, that movement, is worth thinking about, and how constraining it is, and how limiting some of that is. And finally, one of her big ideas in this second book is this idea of comparative judgment, and comparative judgment and no more marking is what she now does, and it's a product. So it's a tool and a product that is for sale. So I think it's worth thinking about. While her ideas in the second book are absolutely fantastic and provocative and really juicy, I think it's somewhat compromised by the fact that one of the main solutions to the way assessment works is a product that she's selling. That's not to say that this work isn't really important, and she's a very rigorous thinker. You can't just dismiss her as quickly as she dismisses Rousseau, Dewey, and Friere, and I would never do that at all. So this is a way of thinking about it. Okay, look, is teaching a science, an art, a dialogue between the two? What is it? Okay, there's a real notion that teaching is a science, and this what works idea, memory, knowledge, retention, the idea of powerful knowledge, and canonical notions of what should be done. And the political implications are clear, for me anyway, that the purpose of education is towards the national economic well-being, international competitiveness, the accountability for public spending, schools need to justify their existence and to justify that they're doing the best for all children. There is a sense embedded in this is a meritocratic worldview, and a lot of the ideas teaching and learning as a science is quite neoliberal, and it fits into that. Whereas some of these other ideas, I think it's worth remembering Dylan Williams' very hilarious, provocative statement: everything works somewhere, nothing works everywhere. It's really hard to think about teaching and learning as science. Now, for me, obviously, I'm deeply invested in formative assessment as a kind of model for approaching and improving your practice. I do believe in research. I do believe in evidence and theory-informed discussion. But I do think that I'm tentative in that it has to be explored. It has to be experimented with. Learning involves the needs and history of the community. It is situated in a place and a time, and it isn't something that just comes from the top and will work. Knowledge should also be situated within an economy of value. All my students have cultural capital, but what cultural capital is valued is worth thinking about. Is knowledge itself the goal, or is a critical positionality towards knowledge? Is the idea that I want my students to become strong economic subjects to earn money, which of course earning money is very important, or can they also be active agents towards social justice and equality? This is all worth thinking about. And who would have thought all of this just from talk? You believe it. You better believe it. A really important last theorist to think, well, not last, second to last, is Matthew Lippman and philosophy for children. So this notion of compliance versus criticality and how philosophy comes into that, and some of you are familiar with this approach to school, I really strongly urge you to read his book Thinking in Education, or any of his earlier books. Again, it's important to historically situate Matthew Lippman. He was a philosophy professor at Columbia, and he was really shocked during the Vietnam War by the underdeveloped reasoning skills of his students. And he was really shocked at the level of discourse in the country surrounding the war. And he wanted to make philosophy more of a central part of education. Not a history of philosophy where you learn major figures from Plato, Western philosophy from Plato onwards, but actually bringing discussion, actually students becoming philosophers as a central pedagogy. And I think, if you're familiar with it, it's built on these four C's that, again, criticality, creativity, collaborative as opposed to competitive thinking, and an ethical dimension of caring as a community about things. And any of you who are interested, you should really think about not P4C being this standalone. I mean, of course, it's amazing that schools make it a subject itself, but as an idea, as an approach, it can infect or become incorporated into all of our teaching. And it's a really powerful way to get students to think out loud in a more rigorous way. On YouTube is an amazing documentary called Socrates for 6-Year-Old, which kind of gives the history of this movement. Moving on, I'm going to take us to the idea of dialogic learning. So right now, this is monologic. This is me talking, and you may be listening, you may be bored, you may feel like what our students are like, you may pause, you may leave the room, you may talk back to the screen, but it's not dialogic in the sense that we're not having a conversation. And Robin Alexander's book, Towards Dialogic Teaching, is a really important piece of work. He's now coming out this year with a Dialogic Teaching Companion. I'd strongly encourage you to go look at this work. Again, well-worn things that we all know, that the difference between what is available, what kind of talk you get in a home of middle-class professional parents, and involving encouragement and exploration and discussion, and how that may not be present in all of our students' classrooms. He has an ethical dimension to what he's talking about, how important talk is in the classroom. While talk is essential for intellectual and social development for some children, the talk which they engage at school is nothing less than a lifeline. That's a really bold statement. He's almost suggesting that that it's an ethical and moral obligation for us to bring talk into the classroom. And dialogic teaching is built on a few principles: that it's collective, that it involves a group, it's not done alone, that it is reciprocal, so that we're talking and we're listening and we're looking at alternatives. It's supportive in that sense that we're a community of people that listen, that we get rid of the notion of embarrassment and fear. It's cumulative, that this talk actually comes in an organized fashion towards some conclusions and lines of thinking and inquiry. P4C does this really well. And it's purposeful. It's not random, let's have a chat, but teachers plan and facilitate dialogue. So what's this mean for teachers? Well, he argues that we need to change the layout of our classroom. We need to have really long activities, not really fragmented moments, to let students really get into things, to focus on ideas, not just procedures. This is how we do something. That we have talk as familiar as writing, as an outcome. We have sustained discussions, and we use this. We respect the fact that we can assess things that are spoken. These are all the different types of talk that he'd want us to see and have. But again, what's crucial, he says, is it's not, we could do everything better, but if we don't actually listen to the answers students are giving, what's the point? There's really no point. If we're not listening, if teaching doesn't become dialogic, truly dialogic, insofar as the student is speaking, we're listening, we're engaging, and we're responding. This dialogic, this back and forth, is really at the center of what formative assessment is. I'm not just delivering, but I'm checking to see where you are, and I'm adapting my teaching. Of course, I can't do that here in this context, which is a shame. So, just to end the theoretical section, I'm just going to talk about these two figures. Lev Vygotsky, a Russian psychologist, really amazing person, and the popularizer of him in America, Jerome Bruner. So Vygotsky's idea is that what you're able to do is kind of within your zone of competence, and then there's a zone where you're unable to do anything, and the mediation to get between what you can do and what you can't do is called scaffolding. And scaffolding is really crucially needs to be temporary, because if it's there forever, you won't really learn what you're doing. So it has to fade away. The teacher gives a scaffold and slowly fades it away. The learner knows how to do something, not just what to do. So they're learning the actual skill of what they're doing. And the mantra really is, what the learner can do with support today, they can do alone tomorrow. And this is a very powerful process. I'm going to go through a little bit more in the next slide. And talk, you shouldn't be surprised, is crucial for this. What he says is external dialogue is slowly and gradually internalized and becomes inner speech. And thinking, basically, conversation just thus leads to thought, which is really crucial. If you take on board seriously what Vygotsky is saying, is that when we teach students to speak to one another, they learn to internalize that process, and talking to themselves is what thought is called. So just to help you understand this idea of the zone of proximal development, if you have a high challenge, low support classroom or task or feeling for a student, they're annoyed, they're frustrated, because it's really hard and they don't feel like they can get there. If it's low support and low challenge, it's just utterly boring. There's nothing pushing or driving the learning. If it's low challenge and high support, it's very comfortable. Students, if you enter a classroom where this is happening, students are very relaxed, because everything is basically laid out for them. Where you want students to be in is this disequilibrium. You want them in the zone of this learning and engagement zone, high support, high challenge. And it's in this zone where all the learning, that's where learning really takes off. How's this going to happen? Well, talk is central to this. Later we're going to talk in another episode about activating peers, but talk is the means for making this happen. Okay, so that was a lot of theory. I mean, I should say that if theory doesn't interest you, I'm sorry for you, but this theory is all what informs why talk is important, what its influence on the learning is going to be. And now let's look at some of Shirley Clarke's practice for bringing this into activity. The first you may think about is the seating, like Robin Alexander said, that rows aren't the most conducive for whole class speech, for paired speech. A classroom built to talk is a classroom where students will talk. She has this other, Shirley Clarke has this one, which is these chevrons, these ways of kind of laying the tables so they're kind of these arrowheads. And what happens is the teacher can kind of come in that gap, and what they can end up doing is talking to 4 people at once and be listening if they need to be and talking. And that imprint can both help paired talk. It can very easily turn into group talk, and the teacher is there constantly moving, constantly listening to multiple conversations. So one of the most practical ways of making talk active in your lessons is to think about the layout of your classroom. One of our more challenging ideas is the idea of random pairing. So lots of schools are very used to a kind of a seating plan that's well thought out, that who sits where is established, and often students of similar progress or attainment, or students who neutralize one another, or for whatever reasoning is given, students sit together, friendship groups, non-friendship groups, whatever they may be. Shirley Clarke would really disapprove. What she would say is that in addition to the curriculum, talking becomes a part of the curriculum. If you look at that set of success criteria, I still use that success criteria every year, no matter what stage, to remind students what it takes. What is the first stage of success criteria for what it means to be a great talk partner? And what students do at the end of every week when they say goodbye to one another in her pedagogy is they reflect on what they're improving on, what they find difficult, reflecting on that, and their target for their next time. And when they get their new partner, they begin by saying, well, this is what I'm progressing on, this is what I have to work on. And in this way, talk becomes central, but the randomization is really important for her. Because what it offers is, particularly for mixed ability teaching, is an exposure to modeling. Each child brings different strengths to the partnership. Everyone in the classroom has to work for everyone, with everyone. So it really starts to build in this culture of learning in the room. Peers constantly learning from each other. All children are given the chance to experience what success feels like, and all of these things really have an enormous impact on the learning culture, on the talk culture, and on the spirit and motivation in the classroom, she would argue. Now, moving on to the idea of wait time. So the very famous research from 1974, Mary Rowe, found that this horrific thing that teachers will wait less than a second after they've asked it on average before to begin the response. So they give almost no thought time. Worse, and I didn't know this until going back to it, after a student starts talking, teachers wait less than a second to start responding, evaluating, correcting, and building on an answer. And this is just horrible in 2 respects. 1, no thought process. 2, no listening time. Dylan Williams says, and we'll talk about questioning in another episode, the idea, a question should be asked for 2 reasons. 1 is to provoke thought, and the other is to check understanding. You have to ask questions, and you have to listen to those answers, not just evaluate them, but interpret them. You need to listen to what the students are saying so that you can utilize it. So what I often talk to teachers about when I observe them or talk to them is, who are you calling on in the lesson? And how do you know? How can you be sure you've talked to everyone or interacted with everyone? And how can you create a culture where students are constantly talking and eliciting evidence the whole time? These are questions I want you to think about, but I already have the answer that I really think you should all sign up to right away. It's this object. it is a popsicle stick. And I'm going to talk you through what you need to do to this popsicle stick. And it's really important that it's physical. I know there's a lot of electronic randomization out there. I think it's really important that the physicality in a teacher's hand can really lead to this technique working. You have to number the sticks so you know how many they are. You have to put the name of the student on the back. You can use a whole other class, and you write the class and form on these sticks. So you have one stick per person. And you now are establishing a lesson where you have no hands up unless you have a question. Now you have to set this law from the start. From the start, it's easier. But if it's something you're bringing a change to your practice, you're going to need to explain to your students that this is why you're doing this. You're doing this to get full participation from the class, to get increased talk and waiting time. And I'm going to talk to you about how we can use this technique to do that. Now, your questions themselves, that's another topic for another day. But what you're going to need to think about a lot is Dylan Williams' idea. Why are you asking the question? What kind of questions are you asking? And you should be asking bigger discussion-based questions. Because bigger questions, trickier questions, require thinking and discussion to go to a deeper level of learning. When you ask a question, you always give pairs talking time. And when you're satisfied, as your ear wigging around that the talking has been done, you stop and you pick a stick. Now, in this way, every single student has spoken in the room, and what you're doing is almost like scientific method. You're checking understanding. And that is the basic notion of the technique. Now, what happens is you take the stick out and you put it down. Once you have all a pile of sticks, you can say with absolute confidence you've spoken to every student today. Now, let me tell you some of the hacks. One hack is students who say, I don't know, or students who don't want to participate. Well, and initially when you do this, students will clam up. Of course, you can create a culture where that isn't allowed or that support is always there. One way that you will always create that support is that you'll never calling on a pair, you're calling on the individual. So when it's time to call, when the name is called, I'm picking on 2 students, never 1. And as a result, no student should ever be sitting alone in any of your classes, because if they're not talking, then they can't be doing the learning well. So when you pick this stick, you are always calling on the pair, and if they're stuck, they should demonstrate to everyone how their conversation works. There's never an opt-out. There's never a chance. So when students don't know or can't do it, give them the opportunity, give the whole class an opportunity to talk about it again. You can swoop in and give those students some help or some support, and then step back and go again. And always, you're creating this culture where we talk to get the answer, not in a gotcha kind of moment. Really advanced practice, what I'm working on, I used to do this better, but of course we all fell out. A bad practice, this comes from P4C, is non-evaluative answering. Once a student responds to pick a stick and say, how would you evaluate what you've just heard? Listen, pick a third stick, and to evaluate both answers. Then you, the teacher, come in and you say, okay, well, 2 of those answers were really strong, or 2 of those made sense to me, but 1 had a fact that was wrong. Turn to your partner and evaluate all 3. Now what you're doing is you're taking the ownership of all learning from you and turning it back into the classroom. Of course, the Christodoulou voice inside of me says, if there are major miscomprehensions and things that students get incorrect, you should correct them. But through effective questioning and redirection, you can get students to be thinking and correcting one another much more. Again, remember, it's no hands up unless you have a question, because a question to the teacher is sacrosanct, is worthwhile when those questions are coming back to you. Of course, you don't have to answer. You can take the question and then ask the class to talk about it in pairs, and then again randomize. Again, this technique has to be experimented with, has to be played with, and it has to be tried and tested and personalized all the time. Another thing you could do is use the sticks to guide you to the students you want to listen to or converse with. So when everyone's speaking or whenever everyone's working, I pick a few sticks and I choose and I just look, who am I going to go speak to? Now, again, this is a way. I don't have the choice. We teachers always will pick the students we want to talk to more. And actually, if we spread it out, we can do a much better job. Some pitfalls you need to think about is when you don't do this technique consistently, it doesn't work. You have to be 100%. So students are always on it. We all, especially as more experienced teachers, we're always improvising our questions. What we need to think more carefully about is planning our questions and placing our questions in strategic moments to get discussion going deeper. Another mistake that is often made with this is to pick a stick first and then ask the question. Why that doesn't work is it doesn't get the whole class talking and discussing. Once the whole class is discussing and exploring, then what you're doing is using a probe to check understanding. If they don't understand, you have to act. That's the basis of formative assessment, and that's why talk here is so important. Another thing you should look at is Neil Mercer did this work for School 21. I really didn't want to shout out School 21, again, because of their monetization of all these programs they've done. But this is actually something quite amazing. Look at that. That's a wonderful physical model for progressing talk. And for the success criteria for talk, it's perfectly visible, broken into these categories: physical, linguistic, cognitive, social, emotional, and ranks them in their importance too in a really wonderful way. This is a set of success criteria that I think the schools should take on as a whole. You should definitely take on as a teacher. And then it's really so much more effective for you to determine what skills you think are most explicit for teaching. How are they gonna learn to talk? It doesn't just happen, okay? It doesn't just happen when I say turn to your partner and talk. They're going to need a model, and they're going to need these scaffolds. And teachers are going to actually need to teach these skills explicitly. And they're not going to be content. They're going to be the skills to facilitate content exploration. And there is going to be a loss there, but there hopefully will be, I can say definitively in my classrooms, there is a greater acceleration once students are talking because they're teaching each other. So here's an example of one type of speaking frame. I would welcome you to steal it, personalize it, but again, think about how are you going to create talking frames, conversation stems, to give students the leg up to get into the class. This might be too much. You might need 3 or 4 to start off, but how are students going to learn to do the things we want them to do unless we show them what success looks like? So what we've talked about in this podcast is talk. I've talked, actually. It's totally monologics, and you are completely overwhelmed and possibly bored, and that's part of the problem with just talking. We're looking for something dialogic, and what we require teachers need to learn to do is listen. To create an atmosphere of rich talk, you need to listen, and you need to create the opportunities and frameworks to make talk happen. You got to think about what is the purpose of talk and why it's present. And I think it's worthwhile spending a little bit of time thinking about these philosophers. You could look at Daisy Christodoulou's version of formative assessment and science of learning and all these things. But what I'm pushed in this session is the idea more of communities of understanding, pairs of understanding, the dialogism that Robin Alexander says is crucially missing from the English classroom and needs to be more. And then I brought you to a real heavy hitter in Vygotsky, this idea that actually through talk, we can push students to be constantly in an area of high challenge and high support. The teacher has to design the lesson and different forms of scaffolding to get you there, but talk is really an important tool for that, and further that talk is a manner of dialogue that turns into thought. Conversation turns into thought. That's a very powerful idea. Thinking about your own practice, you're going to need to think about the way you seat your class. If you are strong enough to be strict with yourself, and much of Shirley Clarke requires a discipline and a willingness to an experiment for an extended period of time. Might you teach talk as a fundamental part of what's going on in your lessons and randomize the pairing of students every week or every 2 weeks? What you are going to need to do right away is get yourself some giant lolly sticks and write all your students' names on them and start the physical randomization of questioning in your classroom. Initially, it'll feel awkward. I've tried to give you some hacks on how to do it, but you're going to need to do it all the time and consistently in your lessons. Further, you're going to think about success criteria for talking, and you're going to think about the idea of stems and Neil Mercer's table for what is it that we're talking about when we talk about talk. That table, let's just go back to it. It's so fantastic. We're talking about the physicality, the words, the language, the thought process, and the way we interact with each other. That is what needs to be explicitly taught if we're going to have talk in the classroom, and of course, talking frames. So I just want to leave you with a few things to think about. We're away from school, so much of this is going to seem theoretical, but I want you to use your imagination and push yourself out of that to think about how, if I've convinced you that talk is essential for all of us in all of our classrooms, how are you going to make your classroom more of a talk-friendly classroom? How are you going to strategically lose some curriculum time to build in these skills for long-term progression? And that's a really tricky question, okay? Because what we have to think about is content, and then we have to think about the means or a pedagogy of accelerating the learning while we're in the classroom. And those skills, to get that, it's going to take some time. How are you going to teach talk? What criteria are you going to use? How can you create a no hands up unless you have a question policy in your classroom and a culture where that works? What challenges do you anticipate in having to implement it? And in what ways do you feel like you're going to try and encourage teach students to find their voice as a part of their identity? And are there any theories or practices that I brought up today that you strongly disagree with and you want to learn more about? You should definitely write me and let me know how you are going, what you thought of this podcast, what you thought of the previous one. Get yourself a copy of the book. I promise you, it is the number one way you can improve your practice, without a doubt. If you are interested in the theory or the practice, you should get a hold of me at any time. There's my email address. I really am looking to have provocative and interesting conversations with all of you about pedagogy. Okay, I hope that was helpful and interesting, and I hope you're okay under this lockdown. Have a great week.